Hey everybody, welcome back to the Jodo cast. I am really excited to be here today with two very special guests. We've got Will Schick and Michael Plummer from Atomic Mass Games. Please say hello and introduce yourselves and what you do.
Hello, I'm Michael Plummer. I'm a senior game developer at Atomic Mass Games and the lead developer on Star Wars Shatterpoint.
And I'm Will Schick, Director of Product Development for Atomic Mass Games. I work on Shatterpoint 2 with Michael Plummer.
And we're going to be talking a lot about Shatterpoint today.
Oh, good. I'm glad that's this one. I thought maybe we made a mistake.
We're going to talk about the I found a little tin of Star Wars pocket models at a thrift store the other day. That's what we're here to talk about.
All right. I look forward to talking about these things.
I will have a lot to say.
Did you play pocket models?
No.
I haven't played it either. I'm like, oh, it was like a weird CCG with like cardboard punch outs that you assembled tiny little cardboard things.
I vaguely remember that.
Well, since neither of you came prepared to talk about pocket models, we are going to pivot to Shatterpoint. So first question is, what are some things about designing Shatterpoint that you've learned since the game came out? Since it's been in the hands of people, what are some things?
Starting off strong here.
Yeah,
starting off strong. I'm going to let Plummer go first.
Yeah. I think like since the game came out, which isn't really that long ago, I think the biggest thing that I've learned is just a little bit about, I guess, trends and what people enjoy playing and like kind of where the line between I want to play a really thematic tag driven synergy built list versus I just think this is going to be good, like put random stuff together and play. And it has helped me, like, as I'm looking at new units and new things that we're working on, kind of figure out where and when to use those tag restrictions and where to let them slip so that a unit can be, splashed into, it's a Galactic Republic tag thing, but maybe you play it with someone else and like kind of what's the balance between how much stuff should be tagged versus how much shouldn't and what characters it should happen on and where.
I think for me, what it's really shown is that we're still in very early days. Like I see a lot of discussion that centers around traditional wargaming talk and tabletop miniatures talk, like damage efficiency and how well a character can output damage is still kind of king of the castle. I think we're seeing more people understand the importance of movement and how out of activation, obviously in any game, the more actions you can get over your opponent, the better off you are, especially in a game like Shatterpoint. But the I think we're definitely seeing the fact that not everything's been unlocked. Players are still getting very familiar with the system and they're learning stuff. And we're about to throw a little bit of a curveball with the new missions. I think it'll be fun to watch how that changes the conversation about what people evaluate and what they see next. But overall, like Plummer mentioned, we've learned a lot through the development process, just in general, of like, okay, where do we want to tag? Where do we not want to tag? What openings do we want to make squad building easier versus where do we need to put more restrictions? And just kind of, in general, one of the things that's always interesting is taking those player evaluations and then applying them forward, because you're never going to get everything right away, right? Like we play within a very consolidated meta, especially when you're first developing a game. You have your play testers who play a lot of games, but they kind of define their own play patterns. And that's somewhat influenced by the conversations that we have directly with them. Like, we want you to test for this. We want you to look for that. What do you think about this? This is our actual intention for how this character is supposed to work. So we're coloring or like skewing a little bit the feedback we get based on being able to directly converse with people and give them guidance or give them our thoughts on things. And then internally, right, we have our own meta as well. So to get like a completely fresh and unfiltered take from people who don't necessarily know maybe what the intention or how the design was based, it's good, because then it tells you, okay, well, we were right here, we were off on this. Like, no matter whether it's a valid play style or not, or a valid use of the character, sometimes those things just don't shake out in a larger, like, global meta. And at that point, you kind of pivot and you say, well, we were evaluating this like this, but maybe that's not as true. So we'll watch for that in the future. Maybe we, learn that to be really effective, a character that wants to be a ranged attacker has to have some kind of reposition tactic so that it can more easily access its ranged potential. Who knows, right? There's so many fun lessons and just kind of growth that you get from watching that. But right now, I still think we're very much in the snow globe's been thoroughly shaken, and we've seen most of the feedback I think we've seen thus far has been very much based on previous like experience with these games, which is good. But also, I'm waiting for that pivot moment where we start to see more and more of the conversations about, okay, what is good in Shatterpoint versus what is good in games like Shatterpoint.
And just to kind of kickboard off of what Schick said about early days, like this is the first game that I've worked on from early days. And one thing that I've learned just in general that I'm going to take with me moving forward is, especially when you're working on something like this, like keep the old notes, because I can go back to the playtest notes about, Django Fett or whatever has come out that people are talking about. And I can read our playtest notes from back then and be like, oh yeah, people were saying that. And then it clears up around here when XYZ comes out. And then I can watch for that shift, and it doesn't happen. Then maybe we know that there's something to look at. But otherwise, it's just like the natural progression of the game. Like, have we seen this before? Have we seen this comment before? Is this something we expected? And have we planned for it accordingly?
Cool. So now, since it is early days, but people have had their hands on it, has the players or the community in general done anything that's been surprising in any way?
I think one of the things that has been interesting from a standpoint of like, here's what we expected, here's where the game is going, is the current kind of focus on damage efficiency or just wounds in general, right? I think we obviously we knew wounds were going to be important, and damage output was definitely a key factor in balancing a lot of stuff. I think we all internally assumed or thought that the overall play styles, especially initially with some of those core box characters like Ahsoka and Asajj, would lead players to develop a fairly quick like objective strike force mentality where it's like, okay, I can really maximize characters that can move around the board very quickly to react and to make up for maybe a deficiency in the first struggle versus the second struggle, or to quickly retake those points as they shift around the board in a way that some of the higher damage output characters can't, because they don't move as quickly. They don't have, Asajj is kind of the one we always go back to. The ability to jump twice and still advance is massive. It's like the whole board basically. She can go from one corner to the other with almost no effort at all, as long as you have the force to do it. And we're seeing, I think we're seeing more of that. We're seeing people evaluate, characters like, or units like Mace Windu with his ability to move two, characters on his activation with his tactic, and how good that is and how you utilize that. But I think we're still seeing damage as king, and to me that's a bit surprising, because I thought there would be a bit more realization, or maybe a counterpoint to that really played into the speed and the efficiency of stuff. And that's not to say it's not there. I think it just hasn't quite like hit the larger conversation where it's like, these things are very good. And that may be because, our viewpoint is skewed on the fact that we know more of what's coming next. And so there are more components to it that are going to build out. But yeah, it's been interesting. Asajj is one of those characters where we had bets in the office on whether she'd get slept on or not. And I think that kind of goes into like what you expect players to gravitate towards and what they're looking at, and all of that stuff. So that would be kind of mine, is that I think we're still seeing a meta that's very dominated, or a player mentality that's very dominated by dealing out wounds and controlling objective play through wounds. And I'm waiting to see that kind of turn around, and for other tactics and possibilities that are within the game to be more fully explored. And then for players to learn how to utilize that against those more like damage focused lists. And the components may not quite be there yet to really maximize that, or it may just take, somebody out there with the big galaxy brain moment of, if I do this and I play that, it works out great. So yeah, it's been interesting.
Making me feel sort of smart, because I'm like, I don't know, but I like being able to jump around and shove people. That's my main goal here.
I think for me, like surprising, it may not be the right word, but like I knew that people were going to gravitate towards playing the characters that they love. But the thing that has really like shocked and grabbed me is the way that people will champion the character that they love. Like I am a Maul player. I love Mother Talzin. And sometimes it even goes down to like a secondary character. Like I love Bo-Katan. She's the best. And that's to me, that's just really charming and awesome. And as a person who like I really like connecting with the characters that I'm playing on the table. It's just really heartening to see people like really love what we have made and really like connect to it and try and find all of the different synergies and strategies. It's been really humbling and really nice to watch people just kind of dig into it and pick their favorite and run with it. And I love watching people try and make it work because they love this character and like that's the biggest satisfaction of games for me. I love watching people try new ideas and come up with new lists and new tactics and try something different and have it work. I love when something like that seems really niche becomes very important in a game and gets you the win. So watching people champion those moments and find them and argue like this is the best ability because when it comes up, it's fantastic. I love that stuff.
I've been very. I don't think I've played a game without Cad Bane since I picked up that expansion.
Yep.
And why would you? I mean,
I,
honestly, he's clearly
yeah,
the best character.
it's very
We
cool.
should really have just stopped there. We've been like,
Mm.
Cad Bane, we're done.
Yeah,
We're out.
Without knowing it, answered a question that's farther down on my list, which is which currently released character do you think players are sleeping on?
Plummer.
Well, I think I know what your answer is going to be, so I'm going to throw a little sidewinder, and I think it's Bo-Katan. I ardently believe that Bo-Katan is one of the strongest secondaries and does not see enough play.
Interesting. Is that with or without supporting Mandalorians, though? Like, does she need the compliment?
She doesn't need it, but she really, really wants it.
Okay, sure. Well, we talked a little bit about internally the Asajj debate, which we had a lot over the course of developing the game and designing the game and everything, and whether or not she would be the most OP popular character or whether she would get slept on. I think for me, so outside of Asajj, who is a really interesting character that does things in Shatterpoint that I don't think you could do in any other game and have it be okay, but it works because she's developed within the Shatterpoint. That just the amount of mobility and stuff that she can do between the Dathomirian dexterity and the force push and the way her combat trees work and stuff. I don't know if, let's see. I mean, I think Padme's probably, and I know she's still very new, so I'm taking a bit of a leap here, but I think Padme is getting a little slept on right now, and that could be because people have only just recently got her and her squad, and they're starting to explore the abilities and tactics. But she is a very powerful Galactic Republic piece. And was one that was very challenging for us to balance internally and to make sure that she did what we wanted, but also was well within line of stuff. And I think she opens up some very interesting and exciting possibilities and synergizes well within the Galactic Republic in ways that, again, I also think she's one of those counter pieces that when played well and with the appropriate strike forces can be a counter to the damage, like I'm just going to wound you meta through her identity and some other stuff. So I'll pick Padme, but absolutely I think the AMG pick without a doubt throughout the entire development process was Asajj. So we had a pool going at one point.
Asajj was my favorite out of the core box right away because of the movement stuff. I'm like, oh, she can just go everywhere. Why wouldn't you want to play with that?
I just think her combat trees, like I look at Asajj's combat trees and I'm like, it's got everything. I love it.
It's also my favorite sculpt out of the core box.
Yeah, she turned out really beautiful. I think one of the things with Asajj too, right, is that when you look at those core box characters, you know, Asajj really wants to be with her master Count Dooku. And so you do have to kind of start putting those pieces together to be like, oh, well, if I take Dooku and I get all of this force refresh, now all of a sudden Asajj has access to her kit without really putting strain on the rest of everything else. And so you start to get those puzzle pieces fitting together, and all of a sudden you can really start to unlock things. I think Asajj works also very well with Cad Bane, despite the fact that Bane gives her not a lot of force, because anytime you can refresh really effectively with Asajj,
Mhm.
she gets to unlock her kind of like combo wombo abilities, and that's when she starts to get really, really powerful.
Can you walk us through the design intent or philosophy behind the rule in Shatterpoint that says a miniature's base must be fully overlapping the terrain? In other words, your mini's base can't overhang stuff.
One time, Michael Plummer was in a grand championship tournament for a miniatures game that will not be named, and his opponent pulled out a wad of blue tack and used it to affix his miniatures in a technically legal position where they wouldn't balance. And he swore from that day forward to never allow that to happen again. It's not true. That's a totally made up story.
Oh.
But
it was plausible. It was 100%
it is plausible. And
I could see someone doing that.
and to be clear, that is actually like the heart and soul of that rule. The reason that we don't allow overhang is because then you get into this rule of, well, how much overhang is too much overhang? And how much of our time are we going to spend trying to carefully tippy balance our miniature so that it will sit in a position where it clearly probably shouldn't sit, but by the rule, because you don't have this like hard overlap, you can just do, right? Tippy miniatures are, well, one, they look kind of gross. Two, they slow down gameplay a lot. And then also, once you start talking about, okay, if you want to play with any type of, and I want to be very clear before I say this word, miniatures games are not precise measuring games. It's impossible. You have human hands, you have human shakes, you have human error. Every rule we write and every game we make is created with the idea that there is going to be some amount of human imprecision injected into it. And that is okay, right? If you need absolute precision, you need a machine to do that and to mitigate it. So we accept from the very start that people are going to mismeasure to some extent. They're going to bump a table, they're going to knock things over, whatever. But if you allow people to do the tippy balance game with their miniatures, at some point you've just exacerbated the imprecision. So you're removing any kind of like precision that you could have on the table, or like stability that you can have on the table, because now, well, if I can place my miniature at a 45-degree angle and I can balance it that way, it's okay. But we all know that miniature, the second a stiff breeze hits it, somebody walks by too quickly at the gaming table, it's going to fall over. And now, okay, we'll pick it and put it back up, right? But we've just introduced a way to put more imprecision into the game, and it breaks you out of the narrative. It breaks you out of the flow, like, because you have to stop and fix the game state, right? We always like to yell game state in our playtest games at each other because we find it funny. So that's really the core of the reason, right? It's to remove those errors and those issues, and it's the cleanest way to do that without being like 5% of a mini's base can overhang. What does that mean, right? Now, how much time are we spending like figuring that stuff out? And then Michael Plummer doesn't have to quit because he has to write rules that effectively like have language for it.
Yeah, I think there's also a big part of it that just comes down to the fact that there has to be a standard. Like, miniatures games are so communal, and they're a thing that you go and you play with other people. And so there needs to be a rule that says this is what you can do in this situation. And we can't do that in every situation. Like, everyone wishes that we could. Everyone, will always say like, "Oh, I wish the rule book had a ruling on this. I wish there was an answer to this like strange situation." But can I put my miniature here is a question that comes up all the time in so many miniatures games that I've played over so many years. And if you're going to be in a situation where you want people to be able to go to a convention and play the game, there just needs to be a standard. Like, this is the rule. It's super easy to understand. Like Shick said, there's no like 10% is that 10%, call a judge, this and that. It's just, can my base go here? Yes, no. And I mean, really, at the end of the day, if you're at home with your friends and you want to ignore it, like, that's okay. But having it in place where if I go and play with a stranger, this is how you play, and there's no question, is just super, super important.
Yeah, like rules that say what's the intent, right? They're always, that's dangerous territory to go into. So the intent of this terrain piece is that a character with a 50 mil base can stand on top of it. Okay, that's fine until you don't agree on the intent, right? Or you weren't aware of the intent, that kind of stuff. And as a hobby miniatures game, we expect that players are going to create fabulous tabletops and different terrain and all this stuff that we didn't craft. So those measurements are going to be different and they're going to be off, and And that's just going to be part of playing the game. But at the end of the day, our goal is to, as Plummer said, give you as firm a foundation so that expectations will not lead to any unnecessary friction between two strangers trying to enjoy a game together. And so, if Plummer and I are playing and he puts, his Bo-Katan on top of a building and I notice that the placement is like slightly overhanging, I'm not even going to care, because I know that it doesn't matter for anything, and that's just how we play. We don't worry that way. If we're in a tournament setting, I'm gonna be like, hey, you got to back up a little bit to be fully on, and he's going to be like, that's cool. I agree with you on that, right? Because we know what the rule is. And that just means that it makes those interactions and the play much quicker because we all know what the expectations are. It also allows us as a studio to design terrain, and for hobbyists out there who are thinking about this stuff, like a tournament organizer or whatever, to design terrain that allows for interesting tactical and strategic decisions. The fact that a B1 base cannot fit on top of a narrow gantry is important to the game. If an objective winds up there, the B1s are now at a disadvantage, and that is purposeful. It's not an accident. We knew that would happen as we were looking at this stuff, and we said, this is great for the game, right? The terrain should have a meaningful impact, and the terrain layout should affect things. And there is an element of the fact that when we create characters or units, we know if they're what size base they're going to be on. So we balance around that as well. We know B1s can't get on narrow gantries. That's intentional. It is accounted for in how they operate, what their point costing is, what their abilities are, all those things, right? So from that foundation, it's not just an arbitrary rule. It's one that actually influences and kind of like spreads out into all different aspects of the game as well.
So what is the process for choosing a sculpt or pose for a character's miniature, and how do you decide which miniature or which characters get multiple like pose options?
Every Tuesday, we call Michael Plummer into the sculpting department, and we hand him a Christmas paper tube wrapper, and we tell him he has 5 minutes to strike as many cool poses as he can, and that determines what your Obi-Wan looks like. That's not true at all. I made that up. It's clearly Friday because I'm just in like GTFO kind of like mentality here. No, I like, so, the first and most important bit to picking a pose is thinking about the character. Who are they? What do they do? What do they stand for? Like, what's their personality like? Because obviously our miniatures only get one pose. They get one way to make an impression, and then that's it. So, it's really important that the pose captures the essence of the character. Like, what do they do? How do they react? Right. So with Asajj, we chose that force push. Like, it's a confident, strong pose. And she's kind of like just flinging you away, right? You're not even worth her time. She's just force pushing you out of her way. She's got bigger fish to fry. Obi-Wan, obviously you go for the iconic, like, Clone Wars Obi-Wan pose where he's taking that Form 3 stance and he is right prepared to defend and attack with his lightsaber drawn. And then you get to things like Grievous, where you have all these different opportunities, and the discussion becomes, okay, well, what is going to create the Grievous of our dreams? Like the imposing, menacing figure. So that leads you to say, well, you want him to be really big. Okay, he's pretty big already, but what if we put him on top of like a destroyed Jedi statue? Ooh, that gets like his hatred of Jedi in there. It elevates him even further. He just looks more menacing. He's now looking down on everyone, which gives you his haughty like confidence, his arrogance, as it were, because he's been trained in your Jedi arts. Of course, you do the four-armed like lightsabers because that gives you all these different pose options. It makes him feel both alien and menacing because he's got all these different weapons. And then you give him the big flowy cape, because what villain doesn't love a big flowy cape? It just adds to the overall like essence of the miniature, the whole generalized look. And our fantastic creative team of art directors and our creative director, Dallas, Josh, and Preston, they draw a whole bunch of poses and they sketch out a bunch of different things that are based on like what our initial talk about the character's essence and their identity and what they're going to do in the game is. And then we start picking them. And then from there, those go to Marco, who is the director of our sculpting team, and Evan, who's the manager, and we talk to our engineer team and everyone else, and we kind of like determine, is this feasible? What will this take? Is it going to be like a lot of parts? Do we have to concern ourselves about how we're grounding the miniature? Are there connection points that are good? And those things get refined until we hit something that we're like, this is both producible, it's awesome, and it speaks to the miniature itself. Once that's all established, it's then at that point that we go, okay, are there things that maybe we should do that are optional for the character, right? For example, like with a Grievous, you could say, well, what if you gave him like combined arms? So he had the blaster, his Annihilator blaster that he has and stuff like that. And those answers are based on always making sure that the pose is the strongest it can be. So if you took away the multi-armed look of Grievous to give him like a single-armed blaster, there's no real way to integrate the blaster in a way that makes it look very good without changing some of the body language. Because like, where's his head looking? Where's the blaster pointed? How does the torso, like everything about your anatomy, even if you're a cyborg man, has an impact, right? So just being like, well, this person both uses a lightsaber and a blaster. And you're like, okay, but to shoot a blaster is very different than to swing a lightsaber. And the way that your torso is, the way that your hips twist, the way that your weight is set, it all changes. And even if you as like a casual observer may not be an artist of anatomy, right? You don't understand or have like spent years studying the human form. As a person, as a human being, you've seen other people your entire life. You've seen people do things, and you yourself have done things. That means that just instinctually you can identify, even if you don't know why, when something looks weird. Like if you've ever looked at a picture and been like, something's really off with that pose. Something about that person looks weird, or that drawing looks really off, or that sculpture looks bad. You know, you may not have the technical knowledge to say exactly what it is, but you as a human being who has interacted and seen other human beings for all of your life can see it. You can just tell. Sometimes the best thing that you can do is put yourself in the pose of the miniature. So if we're arguing about like an art piece, or we're looking at a sculpt that's come in for cam, and it's like something seems wrong, something seems off, but you can't explain it, you just simply mirror the miniature, you do the pose. And 9 times out of 10, once you start taking the pose, you're like, oh yeah, that leg is too extended, this is really uncomfortable, I would never do this. Or turning your hand this way when your body's this way is like really awkward, like no one would do that. Your body knows what it can do and how it feels, and so then you apply that to make the miniature feel very correct. So it's a huge process, and then that kind of comes into like extra parts, different builds. Star Wars, one of the easiest things to do though always is to like, do you have a helmet, do you not have a helmet? Like swapping a head is usually pretty easy. There's frame space and other things that we have to consider with that, and of course every part that you add adds time to the sculpting and the engineering and stuff, so we do have to be aware of those timelines. But if we can do it without affecting the overall like awesomeness of the final miniature, we 100% will. But there's a whole nuance of things that kind of goes into how you do optional builds and everything else, and you know, how wildly different do you want the build process to be to hit these different things. And one of the great things about Shatterpoint is the fact that because we're capturing these characters in specific points in time, and not only the points in time, but also their unique role within the game, primary, secondary, supporting, you know, we can go back at any point and do a secondary Grievous who doesn't have the forearms. He's got the blaster. Because that's more of like his role, right? The lungs have been crushed and he's coughing like he is in Revenge of the Sith. And so he's not as dynamic and active at this point. And that makes him a good secondary character. So we'll do a different pose for that. So we have the opportunity to go back and give those different looks at these characters as well in a meaningful way, not just from a sculpting perspective, but from a game perspective.
And just to share, like I'm not a part of that process. It's outside of my department, but it is very important to like the creation of the game as well. I think in a way it all starts with the miniature, because the way that the timelines work out, like we get to see these miniatures when we're starting the development on them, and everything starts with a design concept from Shick that says like this character is this kind of character. They attack, they jump, they do this, they defend their friends, whatever. And then so basically I get that, and I get the miniature. And a lot of the times, like when I'm trying to come up with the names for abilities and things, I'll just stare at the miniature and turn on the movie and listen to the scene, but not watch the movie, just look at the miniature and just write down the quotes that hit me that say like, yes, that's it. And then try and match that to the idea of what the character is supposed to do. And sometimes even the like what the miniature looks like informs what the character does more than the document, because sometimes the document says it's going to do this and then you see the miniature and you're like, no, it's got to do this, and it's right sometimes and sometimes it's wrong, but it's part of the whole collaborative process in the same way that the art is, that everything is. We talk about everything, and like, I don't know, sometimes they'll say, what does this character do in the game? Oh, we'll add this to the art. Like, does it need this weapon?
Mhm.
It's very cool working in this environment.
Awesome. By the way, I think Grievous is definitely my favorite mini in the entire game.
Oh yeah. I
Yeah,
mean, still he's probably the number, and then it's rare for something to last past its release date, but I think you and the studio agree that Grievous is still top notch.
amazing.
It's so cool. So this is a bit of a long question, sort of. It's kind of rambly, so bear with me. So I am fortunate enough that my favorite characters are already in the game. Cad Bane, and we know Chopper is coming. So my question is, who are your favorite Star Wars characters? Does their status as staff favorites make a difference in how soon they might come to Shatterpoint? And did Simone's love of Hondo help bump him up the queue?
That's a tough hitting question.
It is.
So we'll let Plummer say his favorites.
Yeah. So
and then we'll dive into the real meat.
I'm a bad pick for this because I am a lot like the community and I love to champion the characters. Like, I love to champion who I'm working on at the moment. This is not saying that this is what I'm working on when I name someone, but if I had to name, like, right now, my favorite character, they also shift a lot because I don't stick to one favorite. Like, a lot of it has to do with where I am. But right now, I think my favorite Star Wars character, and for a little while now, has been Sabine Wren, because I really connect with the idea of found family and being a little bit of a black sheep and being different than the people that brought you up. And so for me, Sabine Wren is very Star Wars, and I love the portrayal in Rebels, and I'm looking forward to the portrayal in Ahsoka when I get around to it. Unfortunately, I've been very busy in my home life, so I haven't had a chance to watch, but coming up soon.
Yeah, I mean, I've made no like, I don't think I've obfuscated the fact that Cad Bane is probably my favorite Star Wars character. And of course he's in the game, so take that as you will. But when it comes, I think another one of my favorites, probably, who's not in the game, it
We could have
would be
two?
Pong Krell. I think you can have two. I mean, it feels a little cheatery to say, well, this person's in the game, and so they're my favorite. But Pong Krell is another one that I found really compelling. I love the Umbara arc. I think a lot of the stuff from that whole like episode run was really cool. But he just has an awesome design. Like, he's got two double lightsabers. That's sweet. That is really cool. Like, come on. And also he's an interesting character because he starts out kind of like hard nosed, but then of course he turns evil, and you're like, oh, of course that's why. And whatever. Spoilers for a show that came out like 10 years ago.
That's so long.
But yeah, so like, does a person's personal feelings on a character like ramp them up or move them up the list? Typically, no. Like the way in which we kind of structure and look at the release schedule, it's very much based on, obviously you want to have a good mix of well-beloved and known characters, right? You wouldn't, we talked a little bit, I think, before about the core box and how you identify those characters. You want those initial offerings to be iconic of what people gravitate towards. Anakin Skywalker is super recognizable for a reason. He's one of the main, if not the main character of Star Wars, throughout the entire like first 6 movies and sort of into the sequel trilogy as well, to some extent. But like, you're not gonna launch a Star Wars game without him, or Luke. You're gonna take your pick, right? Depending on which era you're in. So you're always gonna hit. And in that way, most characters are super popular, not just because they're the main characters, but good main characters are the ones that are most relatable. People, if you make a unrelatable, like boring main character, your story is not going to go very far. People are gonna be like, well, I really hate that person, I'm out. Like, no one's going to be like, I'm interested to see what happens to this person I have no emotional attachment to and find annoying. Like, it's usually not a recipe for success, right? So in some ways, uh, it's kind of easy because most of the characters that people really love are the characters that you're going to do anyway, because they are the most, the most iconic and the most important characters to the franchise. I think there is an element of like those deeper cuts though, because you don't just want to focus on the primary cast. You want to show, we want the world of the game to feel deep and interesting and vibrant and alive. And your secondary and supporting characters, your lesser characters, are the way you do that. They're the ones that really frame and like set up the world to feel interesting and real. And so you get to that stuff, and then all of a sudden it kind of does become like if Plummer comes up and he's like, what character I really love? Not Urveb. What an interesting guy. He shows up for one episode. He's really overconfident, and Grievous skewers him. And wouldn't it be great to let Grievous skewer that guy in the game? And you're like, oh, that's kind of interesting. Like maybe there's something there, right? Like that is kind of a cool idea or a cool character. So I think people's love of the property, their love of the story, does lead to conversations about who would be interesting to add to the game, who outside of the main cast of characters is someone who like we think would be a good inclusion to the game. And then those things, those conversations kind of organically happen. And then as we're working on the 5-year plan and as we're looking at the schedule and we need to fill slots, they'll work their way in, or we'll come up to a character and say, well, we really want to do X, Y, or Z character. We know they're a primary unit, but what goes with them? And at that point, you either start doing some research about characters that have worked with them, or more often than not, you find the person who's the champion of that main character, the person who loves a Plo Koon or loves a Padme Amidala, and they're like, oh yeah, well, you should put him with this person and this one. Or if you're going to do this version of the character, you're going to do these, because, it all filters down. Right. So, and then there
I
are
will.
times, oh yeah, go for it. Go for
I
it.
was
Say
just
it,
going to say,
Plumber.
I will say that while what Schick says is true, that it does not move things up and down when we're going to make them, it does create an unenviable situation for Schick and sometimes myself, where not only do we get to watch the wish list of all the community, but there's this like second, smaller secret wish list of people that work at AMG and are like, you know what you should make? It'd be this. And my response is always, I don't even decide what we make. But like everyone has their wish list. We're all the
Mm-hmm.
same in that regard. And it just doesn't change. Like people always want their favorite characters. So yeah.
Yeah. Well, and then like there's also this thing where, there's a legacy of Star Wars miniatures games now from FFG and what, Legion and X-Wing and Armada, and we've become stewards of those games as well. And each of those games kind of has its own ability to inject certain characters into it, right? Legion probably being the most interesting of them because, well, anyone can kind of pilot an X-Wing or an X-Wing style ship, right? It's pretty easy to make a pilot that you can find the starfighter that person would fly and get the character name in there. In Legion, because as we've talked about, it's this big army game that's more focused on the army as the character rather than the individual characters. There are certain individuals that it's hard to find a spot for or a meaningful place in Legion. For instance, Hondo Anaka. Hondo is definitely an iconic Star Wars character. I think, everyone at this point who's of a certain age would recognize Hondo. I mean, he leads the Millennium Falcon Disney ride, for crying out loud. You see him. So even if you didn't know anything about him, by the time that you've gone to Disney and ridden that ride, you're gonna be like, this character is interesting. But he doesn't immediately fit into the Legion environment. So then you're like, well, Shatterpoint's a great place for him. It's character focused, it's character driven. It kind of he's part and parcel of those wild, zany Saturday morning adventures. So absolutely, let's take the opportunity to fill more of the Star Wars like mythology and galaxy that we necessarily haven't been able to touch in Legion yet. And that works with the whole idea that we've talked about before, which is that each of these games doesn't work against each other or isn't its own box. They're all within the same sandbox. And together they create this overarching like Star Wars galaxy that players can jump into and play and experience the different aspects of Star Wars. So yes, you can't get your Hondo Anaka necessarily in Legion, but you can jump into X-Wing and have him like do a daring raid in his starfighter, or you can bounce into Shatterpoint and have him with his Weequay pirate band go off with Cad Bane and cause havoc and mayhem as they steal things, right, from the Galactic Republic. And that really, I think, is where those characters get bumped up, right? If you have a character who you're like, this character would be really awesome and I would love to do it, and it doesn't make sense in, say, a Legion, then it usually rises up the charts on the Shatterpoint, because that's the point of Shatterpoint, is to provide us the space to be able to do that kind of stuff. And so that's really fun. And it is one of those things where like you look at the different games and you go into parallels and you say, okay, how do we make that work? And so Hondo Ohnaka, favorite of Simone Elliott for sure. But also, I think everyone in the studio was just excited to have a way and a place to be able to bring that character into miniature form, where he could really shine and he could be the Hondo that everyone expects him to be.
I was also just really excited for an excuse to shout Hondo Ohnaka quotes in the playtest room for like a solid 3 or 4 months.
Oh man, I cannot wait to find out what he does on the table.
Everything you would expect Hondo Ohnaka to do, really, in terms of being a shady little pirate. Businessman, a legitimate-ish businessman, let's put it that way.
At Mini Stravaganza, we saw the order cards for the Spectre characters are getting a slightly different treatment to look like the wanted posters, which I think is fantastic. And is this a one-off thing, or should we expect more fun order card treatments down the line?
So those order cards are an interesting story, and this is kind of a lot of the things that people see, from Worlds prizes to promotional like order cards for the Phoenix Squad or Phoenix Cell, to like everything else, right? They typically come from the fact that so many people at AMG, including one of our big graphic design gurus, Ryan Ritter, are huge fans of the property. And from folks like putting in amazing quotes onto the dev rules to the art directors like trying to find all of the little Easter eggs to put into the character pieces or the bigger splash pieces, to graphic design like fitting an Arabesh or other kind of like elements into the design of the boxes, and the sculptors putting little critters on the bases and all of this stuff. Like at every level, the passion and the excitement for these worlds that we get to be a part of kind of seeps in. And so those specific cards, Ryan Ritter just made them. He was like, I had this cool idea and I thought this would be amazing, and so I did it. What do you think? And we were like, yeah, those are super dope. Let's use them and let people have the opportunity to get them in a cool way. So will you see more wanted posters? Maybe. Will you see just in general more cool and like thematic stuff? I have zero doubt, because the fact of the matter is that, we love making games, but we also just love playing in these worlds and getting to kind of express those worlds and bring them to life in different ways. And we're, like Plummer mentioned, we try to make the studio as open and collaborative as possible, where if somebody has a fun idea or they have a thing that they just like whip out because they're excited about it, it's an environment where you share it, and oftentimes it'll wind up finding a home somewhere.
Yeah, and I think it's really cool just because we're all big nerds and we love Star Wars, just like all the hobbyists out there playing Shatterpoint. And in a way it's very similar, like doing a conversion with your miniatures. Like just Ritter threw together these cards and they were awesome. And I remember talking to Ritter like way back when he first had the idea and was like, well, maybe I'll draw these up. And I'd never thought it was gonna necessarily come around. I was like, well, maybe there'll be time. And then they showed up and I was just like, these are cool. I need a set of those.
Yeah. Yeah, so
cool.
So there a lot of the really great stuff. It's not necessarily planned. It's just a little passion project on the side where the person had some time and they had an idea and they wanted to make it happen. And we definitely want to honor that and find a spot for it and make it work if we can. So yeah, everyone who loves those cards and that design, they can give a shout out to Ryan on all the social medias and stuff, because he is probably the biggest Star Wars nut and fan in the entire office.
Yep.
his love for the property, his knowledge for the property, like everything about it, it goes super deep. And part of, I think, what makes him so amazing as a designer for the product, from product packaging to card design to everything else, is just that knowledge and that passion for it. He gets Star Wars in a way that we're very lucky to have.
Absolutely.
So, which of the current releases, and maybe it makes sense to exclude the core box from this, were your favorites to playtest, or the most challenging to sort of lock into their final form?
Okay. For me, I'm gonna have to go with a tandem duo because we worked on them at the same time, and that is what made it very hard. And that is going to be the entire Padme Amidala squad box and the entire Plo Koon squad box at the same time was a little bit of a nightmare just because they're both so unique compared to the core box stuff and everything that we had worked on up to that point. And we've shown Plo Koon's card at Mini Stravaganza. So like that identity, I love defensive abilities in games. I love defense, and defense never gets to be strong because it's not as much fun for the game most of the time. So we knew that like Plo Koon, we really wanted to have like this defensive identity, and I really wanted to get it right. It was super important to me that we get it right and it's good, but it's not overpowered, this, that, and the other. And then Padme Amidala sitting over here, and half of her identity is also like a super defensive, control oriented thing. And trying to like make those both work at the same time, and especially when we would play them at the same time, because you have to do that, especially when they're coming out together, because you know people are going to buy them together and want to throw them on the table immediately. Like it was super challenging, and I'm really happy with where we landed out. But I definitely got more headaches than I think I wanted from that duo. But in the end, they're two of my favorites. So
I think so. I agree with Plummer. Those were definitely some of the more challenging releases to balance and get right. Um, but I think the most fun playtesting stuff that we had, which half is released and half is announced, so I think it still counts,
yep,
was the Cad Bane Hondo Inaka. Like,
I
because those two packs originally were going to come out a little bit closer together, so they were play tested in the same block, and they were really the introduction to the Scoundrels. Like those two represent, and Cad Bane still does, with the bounty hunters, but those two really represented the I don't want to pick a side, I want to pick my own side. And so they were so fun to concept, and it was so fun to kind of explore that different and new space. And then also the way they paired together and just kind of how they worked out and built off of each other was a blast. Like they really captured it, and I was so happy with how they kind of paired together, and they captured this thing where on paper you look at them and you're like, this has to be the worst pairing possible. There is zero way that you can be successful running these two squads together, because by the numbers it doesn't add up. It just, like, you're going to tell me that this can go against Dooku and Grievous? No, it's impossible. And then you play it, and if you play it correctly in the way that it synergizes and the way that it works, all of a sudden you're like, oh, they looked really weak, but no wonder Hondo was able to capture Count Dooku. He's a very clever weak way. And he's very like sneaky. And Cad Bane has his own thing with his bounty hunters. And so I think it was just really satisfying, and it was really fun to see that narrative play out on the table, and also to be able to create this thing that offered a very clear third option to kind of what we were working on at the time, which was, you're typically your Galactic Republic or your Separatist Alliance, because that's how you kind of launch the game. But now we're starting to get the Scoundrel stuff, and a lot of that really informed the things that came later that weren't part of like a dedicated group, right? Plummer talked a bit about the tags, and I think it was such a springboard into helping define the Rebel Alliance, which we look at the Rebel Alliance, from a story perspective, we say, oh, that's a group. They're very organized and they work together and they're basically like a faction. But the reality is they're not. They're just a disparate like group of well-funded like troublemakers that has varying degrees of connectivity to each other, right? Like Han Solo is a rebel, I guess, but not really until like much later in the story. So having that idea or that foundation of like how does a disparate like group of scoundrels work helped really inform how the Rebel Alliance would start to feel. Whether it's, are you part of the organized Rebel Alliance? Are you tangentially related to the Rebel Alliance? Are you just lumped in with rebels because you don't serve the Empire? And that started to make some really interesting connections, and I think really helped make the Galactic Civil War stuff all the better for it. In addition to just kind of setting the stage for things like the High Republic with the Mandalorian and Child, and even Moff Gideon to some extent, and how the Imperial Remnant would kind of synergize back and forth and all these things. So it was a very fun and I think a really fruitful pairing to play and learn a lot of lessons about and see how things worked. And for me, that's when Shatterpoint really came alive. Like, I loved having the big lightsaber duels on the gantries and stuff in playtest. And of course, we're using our mind's eye because playtest materials are not as exciting as that. But the game was really fun, but it wasn't until we got to that point to where I was like, oh, I see the beyond the normal Star Wars story now forming, and where players can go with this, and how this game can really enhance your ability to partake in the Star Wars like galaxy. And that was, I think that was like the moment where I was like, okay, I'm all in on this.
I still remember because it was pretty early in testing at that point, and like not a whole lot of stuff was locked. And you came in and you said, "I'm playing Cad Bane and Hondo," and I kind of looked at you. I was like, "You're doing what now?" All right, I guess go ahead. And I was playing Dooku and Asajj, and I was confident. Dooku and Asajj, I've got all this ready to go. You proceeded to just absolutely run the table on me, and I remember just sitting there at the end of the second struggle, the very short second struggle, and just going, "What did you just do?" And it was very satisfying. Like I couldn't even be mad about it because it was so cool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was fun. It was, so that pairing and that moment I think was really great, and did have a lot of implications going forward into things. So that would be my pick. But there have been a lot, like much like the sculpting team and the engineers are always like, whatever they're working on now is the coolest thing, and whatever came out before is like, it's passe and trash, as they like to call it. They're like, oh, that's trash. The thing we're working on now is way better. Because you're kind of always looking towards the horizon and what you can do next. That was definitely it was a big moment. We had a lot of fun, and so many of them had been fun that it's kind of hard to pick. Like, I remember playing Luke and Vader against each other for the first time, those two squads, and having the moment where Plummer's Luke Skywalker courageously leapt away from me onto a gantry, and I lost my effing mind because I was like, it's the movie. That's what happens in the movie. You just movied me. Because he's like, I'm going to use I will not fight you and jump up here. And I was like, oh my, it happened. And like, we had to stop playtest for about 5 minutes because I had to tell everyone what just happened because it was brilliant. I was just like, this is it. This is what you hope will happen. And here it is, like, organically happening on the table.
And the best part about that is it was like a week prior that Chick had just been like, that ability should let him jump. It was his idea, and then he saw it happen. He still just lost it. It was great.
Yeah.
Winding down the interview here, what other games are people at AMG and you two in particular playing these days? Either video games or tabletop games. Just what are you guys into right now?
Oh, I know what Plummer's playing right now because it's all they talk about. So I'm waiting for him to say it.
I've got a big 3 right now. So I'm playing Diablo 4, and enjoying that a lot on Eternal. I'm playing Guilty Gear Strive because I love fighting games, and Exceed Fighting System, which is a card game based on fighting games, which I am currently obsessed with.
Nice.
And I can confirm the man hasn't the man hasn't gone out to lunch with any of us because him and Pagani and Ben continue to just play that game over lunch and not eat. It's very rude, but they love it to death.
What was that? Can you say that the name of that game again?
Exceed Fighting System.
Exceed. Okay, cool. I've never heard of that one.
Neither had I.
Yeah, it's an interesting one that there's a lot of sets for it, but yeah, it's kind of flown under the radar. So cool stuff to it, especially if you're a big fighting game fan, which both Plummer and I are. We have our qualms about which system. There's a couple of different fighting game systems for cards that are out there. Universus, Exceed, UFS before Universus. Which one did it better? Which one does it best? Kind of comes down to which one's available too, because
Yeah,
some of them you can't get anymore.
true.
But we have hot debates about that. Let's see. For me, what have I been playing most recently? I've been doing video game wise, it's been a decent amount of Street Fighter 6, although getting my body and soul prepared for Spider-Man 2, because that's gonna consume my Thanksgiving, zero question. Like I'm not I had meniscus repair surgery 2 years ago, and it was perfect because it was right over Thanksgiving, and I had I had an excuse not to move anywhere, so I just like sat in front of the game system and I just played 100% of Spider-Man, the original Spider-Man. Just 100% it was amazing, so I'm looking forward to that. And then board game, like card game wise, we've been doing a little bit of Tainted Grail or Tainted Avalon, the Tainted Grail system, which is a really interesting, like super narrative driven board game in quotes event. I really like the weird stuff they did and how it combines kind of RPG elements and exploration, and there's some video game like RPG elements. It's very different, but very cool, and the world building I think is really neat and interesting. So that's been fun. And then I've been doing we've been playing a bit of Heat, which is the Formula One racing game, which I think has some really interesting mechanics. So we'll throw out a Formula One race every once in a while and have fun with that. And then, and then otherwise, like we'll do some Shatterpointing and some Crisis Protocoling and some Legion in the house every once in a while. But those take longer to set up, so we don't get as much of it done now as we would have liked. But those are probably the big ones.
Last question. So, for the audience out there who maybe isn't as big into Star Wars, a holocron is like a data repository that typically like one person will like fill with whatever they feel like saying that they want to. So, what topic would you choose to talk about and store within a holocron? Someone's going to find it. They're going to open it up. Your little hologram's going to pop up and just start rambling at them about a certain topic. What topic do you pick?
Wow. Cooking basics, what you need to know, and good, solid, simple, easy to learn recipes that then later, like that teach you the basics so that you can then go on to cook anything at home. Because I think that learning to cook and feed yourself and your family is like the most important skill that you can learn that a lot of people have missed.
I feel like I could use that holocron.
That's a really solid one. I mean, if we're being real, like if I'm just being honest with myself, my holocron would just be a bunch of inane rambling of whatever popped into my head, because I have a very Plummer knows.
That's true.
I have a very meandering river, and I'll go anywhere and talk about anything and then snap back to something else because the connections make sense to me. So my holocron would probably just sound like the ravings of a lunatic. But if I was going to dedicate a lesson to my holocron, I think Plummer's cooking one is great. For me, I would really hope to impart how to debate and dialogue with each other. Like, I think that's a skill that is sorely missing in so much of our discourse these days. In the fact that, how do you disagree with a person? How do you discuss ideas with a person? And then once you've heard their side of it, how do you process that and use it to make yourself more knowledgeable and better? Even if you don't ultimately agree with their point of view, the fact of the matter is that all of our points of view, when taken together, can build up your knowledge base and your understanding of the world, because things are not black and white, right? It's all shades of gray. How do you, and this goes back to like, there's a really interesting study where Russian speakers, people who are natively born to Russia, they can see like 2 additional colors than Western speakers because their language has words for those colors and they're taught those words from birth. So because there's a word for it, they can identify a color that we as Western speakers typically cannot see because we don't have a word for it. And that's it, right? Like that is the reason that we all exist together. And that is why understanding how to be able to discourse and dialogue and debate with each other in a healthy way is so important, because once you learn the word for it, you can see it. Even if you like the color or not, it doesn't matter. You can't see the color until you know it's there. So why would you close yourself off from the ability to better experience the world? It doesn't mean that you agree with it. It doesn't mean that you even have to accept it. But knowing it's there then allows you to it allows you to realize that it exists. And then you can take that information, you can process it, and you work more from there. So that, to me, I feel like, and it's critical to what we do as designers and developers. We're basically always arguing with each other, really. But it's not in a contentious way. It's in a, let me understand your point of view so you can understand my point of view, and we can better get to the universal quote truth of what we're trying to do. And every time, regardless of whether I agree with, my fellow devs or the artists or the sculptors or whatever, whether I agree with, what they're saying or not, the fact is that once I understand what they're seeing, it then informs my view of it. And sometimes it leads me to entirely different suggestions, entirely different solutions, just as it does them. And so we all become better when we're willing to listen to each other. Like, win, lose, or draw, it doesn't matter. It's simply just being able to absorb another person's perspective is so important and can build you up in a way that you can't yourself.
That's fantastic. Sounds like very Jedi stuff. They both sound actually very Jedi things. The first one, actually, there's man, I'm blanking on his name. It's called the Blade of Bardata. He's from the High Republic books. He basically retires from being a Jedi to become a cook.
Yep. that was one of my other dreams, was to go to culinary school. So yeah, like when I was like 27 or 28, I wrote a letter to a chef that I really loved on TV, and they emailed me back a very encouraging thing about going to culinary school. And so there is another timeline in which I am a pastry chef.
You could always, combine them, and instead of miniatures, they're like cupcakes. Brainstorm that.
And then you have to eat them before they go bad.
Because there's that miniatures game where you make the minis out of like Play-Doh and you smush them when you defeat them.
Smash them. Yeah.
Yep. And then you can just eat them.
Very cool. Yeah. It reminds me of the one of our favorite board games to play when I was in high school, which was totally not age appropriate for being in high school, was Grape Escape.
Yeah.
Where you made little clay grape people, and then basically it was just like a mouse trap, but throughout the course there was like scissors and there was a hammer. And there were a bunch of ways to like mash your grape. And if you got caught in one of the traps and your grape got destroyed, you went back to the start. Like,
I love that.
No real strategy to it, because you're just hoping to roll properly and not get caught in the traps. But we love that game. We played it all. I think it was just the fact that you got to mash Play-Doh. So yeah, I'm all in. Like mashing clay figures is great. We can make them out of like rock candy and smash them. That'd be fun.
Oh yeah, that'd be good.
Okay. Well, do you guys have any, now that we've got the inside scoop on AMG's next big game, any closing thoughts here before we say goodbye?
I think just that, like, we've only just begun. There's so much cool stuff coming for Shatterpoint that I'm not allowed to talk about, that I wish I could talk about, and I can't wait to see what everybody thinks of it, and everyone have a good time with it, and really looking forward to enjoying the rest of the ride with everyone. So thank you all so much for playing and for enjoying what we do.
Can you give like a marketing safe spoiler about one of the things you're excited about, though?
Man, the Phoenix Cell squads are just so much fun, and I can't wait. Sure. I know, love it.
Sure, no, I mean,
and that's super
it's been
marketing
announced.
Safe.
It's
very
marketing safe. Very marketing safe. Very marketing safe. Yeah, no, I mean, I'm with Plummer. There's so many exciting things on the horizon, and we've done a lot so far, but we have so much more planned, and I'm excited to watch as players develop and learn skills, and they kind of will. It's an interesting thing, like we talked about, right? Watching how metas across the globe evolve and the number of games played just outstrips what we could ever do internally. We get to learn just as much as the players do about what works, what doesn't, and we get to analyze that. And to me, that's very exciting, because it just means that we can become better at what we do and make the next round, benefit from that, and then learn where we might have been a little soft, and we can always go back and address that as well. when the time is right and when we have enough data to make smart decisions. Because the one thing that we'll always say is that we're never going to be perfect, but we're going to try to be as perfect as we can. And when we miss the mark, we'll figure out how to go back and hit the mark. So, for us, it's not an out the door and done. It's a forever friend. It's development that never stops, both backwards, forwards, and where we are now.
Well, Michael Plummer, Will Shick, thank you guys so much for taking time out of your day to talk to me and all the people at home about Shatterpoint and all the other stuff. Just thank you guys so much for making the things that you make and bringing these fun toys and games to our homes and letting me in on some of that joy. I get to put that on my table, and it's just a blast. I really appreciate it. Thank you guys for talking to me today.
Thank you so much for taking the time to be, a huge part of the community. I know that everything's born from passion, but we really appreciate everyone who covers the games and is willing, you open up dialogue among communities, and that's a huge thing. So we greatly appreciate the support. Can't overstate it enough. And the positivity and everything you bring to the folks out there. So thank you very much. It's a pleasure as always to be on, and we can't wait to be back again.